So, ladies and gentlemen, I haven't introduced an author at this event in a couple of years, but I generally prefer to walk around unencumbered, left to my own anxieties. But this combination of writers is taking me at least temporarily out of retirement. I'll start with Ron Charles. Ron, who is the deputy editor of the Washington Post Book World, and in my opinion, America's foremost fiction critic. We look forward to Ron's book reviews every Wednesday because not only is he an extraordinary writer and a discerning critic, he's also clearly a fan of the craft. Ron delights in the style and metaphor of the books he's reviewing, always doing his best to point out the author's triumphs while and honest but constructive in pointing out the book's weaknesses. His reviews are witty, insightful, and sometimes touchingly personal. I'll further add that his video series, the Totally Hip Book Review, which you can find online, just type in Totally Hip Book Review or Ron Charles videos into Google, and you will find they're amazingly funny and definitely worth your time. We in the D.C. area are lucky to have Ron and his lovely wife Dawn as part of our literary community. Ron's a great friend of our festival. Having done programs like this for each of the last 4 years, we're grateful and honored by his support and involvement. So let's give a hand to the brilliant Ron Charles. It was actually one of Ron's reviews just over a year ago that called my attention to and inspired me to read Anthony Marra's exquisite debut novel, A Constellation of Vital Phenomena. And I've been raving about it ever since. Some people in this audience are the recipients of that raving. During the course of my evangelism about this book, whomever I'm speaking to invariably asks, what's it about? And on the top level, of course, the book's about a young girl rescued by her neighbor in their quest for survival amid the civil war in Chechnya. However, I'd always add in these conversations that, like all great literature, this novel is really about everything. All of life seems to exist within its pages. The beauty, the horror, the tragedy, light and humor, love and guilt, selflessness and sacrifice, and everything in between. It's a remarkable achievement. And to be clear, not just remarkable for being a debut novel, or remarkable because Tony is ridiculously young to have tapped into such wisdom and perspective. Constellation would have been as much of an achievement had it been written by Philip Roth or Peter Matheson or Cormac McCarthy or Tim O'Brien. This book is destined, in my opinion, to be a classic. And everyone here who walks away with a signed copy, I believe, has a collector's item on their hands. Constellation was the Washington Post Best Book of the Year in Fiction. It was named Best of 2013 in many, many publications and websites. It won a National Book Critics Circle Award, an American Booksellers Association Award, the newly minted Carla Cohen Award, and was longlisted for the National Book Award, among many others. I'm sure we'll find out later that during the course of this program, it won 3 or 4 more awards. It absolutely deserves them. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Anthony Marra.
Thank you very, very much for that generous introduction.
Thank you, Judd. That was wonderful.
It's so nice to have you here. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for inviting me and for being willing to chat.
I heard about your book before it was published from a friend of mine who was an author who said she was reading this incredible book. It was about Chechnya, and immediately my interest evaporated. So I didn't know the word Chechnya.
Tends to be the case.
Yeah, where is Chechnya?
Yeah.
I mean, Chechnya only briefly appears on the radar for most of us. We've heard something about the conflict with Russia. The Boston bombing brought it into the news. But for most of it, it's a place most Americans don't know. How did you come to know anything about it?
Well, I sort of started, the initial interest came from a place of complete ignorance. I was a college student studying in St. Petersburg, Russia. And I lived down the street from a Russian military cadet academy. And every day I'd see these 16, 17-year-old kids in their powder blue uniforms marching up and down the street in formation. And they'd march past this metro station where on the platform, a few hundred feet below ground, Russian veterans of the Chechen wars would congregate. And they also wore their uniforms, but theirs weren't nearly as clean, not nearly as well kept. Some of their trousers were hemmed because they had lost their legs. And it seemed like there was this vast chasm separating this street where these kids a few years younger than me were marching around, and this metro platform where young men a few years older than me were barely surviving. And of course there was a chasm, and that was Chechnya. And at the time I didn't know anything about it. It was vaguely synonymous with far-flung terror and poverty, and that was really it. And so I started reading various history books, journalistic accounts, just sort of to fill in this gap in my own understanding of the body politic in contemporary Russia. And the more I read, the more fascinated I became with its history and culture. It was a place that Tolstoy and Lermontov and Pushkin all visited and wrote about. It was almost this proving ground for the 19th century great Russian writers. But more than anything, it was these stories about everyday civilians who weren't particularly political or particularly religious in the current conflict that really sort of resounded with me. The ways that they would try to maintain some vestige of decency in these indecent times. Right. And at one point I tried to find a novel that had been set in Chechnya over the course of the past several decades that was available in English. And I went to Politics Prose and checked out their shelves, and there were none. And so I came to write the book because it was the kind of book that I wanted to read, but it wasn't there.
Wow. If you wrote a book set in the Civil War or the Revolutionary War, you could assume a great body of common knowledge with your reader. You couldn't assume that with this book at all.
No.
So after you did all this research and had it, how do you put it into the novel without the novel really weighing down with a lot of backstory?
Yeah, it was interesting just hearing Alice McDermott. There is this tendency to want to, you've gone to the library,
Exactly.
you've printed. Look, I
you
went
know
through,
so much.
like so many highlighters and Post-it notes. I mean, come on. But I really tried to strip all of the research down to what was essential to understanding the individual characters and their circumstances. And I tried to find small ways of sort of giving context. With something like, if it was set in World War II or the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, you're absolutely right that it's almost like a diorama in which you're putting characters inside a contextual box.
Right.
That
You don't have to tell us who the Nazis were, for instance.
Exactly, yeah. Whereas in this case, you were sort of building both the characters and their habitat. So I created a character named Kazan, who was a historian, and he attempts to write this epic 3,000-page history of Chechnya. Every time he gets close to finishing, a shift in the prevailing political winds in Moscow means that he has to go back to the beginning and rewrite it to conform to the prevailing political ideology. And little devices like that were useful in trying to make the history essential to the actual characters' lives and their stories.
And the plot is driven by external factors, religion and politics, but the people in the book, the people the book's about, are not particularly political, and they're not particularly religious either.
Yeah, I was thinking about this earlier today, just what is it that makes us want to read a story? And I read The Goldfinch, which is this 800-page, beautiful, it's a masterpiece. And you're able to tear through it just because there's this one simple question: what's going to happen with Theo in the painting? And I think that sort of underlying very complicated stories, there's often just this one simple question that we want to figure out what's going to happen next. And so in Constellation, that question was sort of what's going to happen to this child, and why has she been put in this position in the first place? And I was hopefully the goal was to take this one simple question and turn it into the spinal column around which the whole fleshy animal of the book was assembled.
And where did you come up with these ordinary peasant people? Did you meet them?
Some were sort of inspired by various people that I had read about. Uh, One of the main characters is a surgeon named Sonia who is running this hospital that's supposed to have 500 people on staff. They only have 3.
And they're not all overqualified.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And she was able to sort of ascend to the role of head of the hospital because there was nobody else there to run it. And she was loosely inspired by a man named Kasam Bayev, who was a Chechen cosmetic surgeon. And he went to medical school in Russia, in Siberia, and he didn't have enough money to both pay for medical school and pay for a place to live. So he lived in the train station while he was going to medical school. And he came back to Chechnya, and he wanted to get into cosmetic surgery. And so he was this cosmetic surgeon who, at the outset of the First Chechen War, was the only person with any surgical experience in this suburb of Grozny, and he single-handedly saved hundreds of lives.
Wow.
He taught himself how to do trauma surgery with carpentry tools, and at various points in the conflict, he was hunted by both sides because he would treat anybody regardless of military affiliation, and he ended up getting asylum in America. But characters like that sort of invariably influenced certain of these. But I was also trying to deal with the kinds of people that would occur in this situation regardless of where it was set. So there's trauma surgeons, there's informers, there's orphans, there's the everyday displaced and refugees. And I was interested in how people, you never set out in life to become a refugee, and how do you deal with sort of the what history compels you to become?
Right.
Were sort of some of the questions that I was asking myself while I was working on these characters.
Is there a passage you could read us?
Sure, absolutely. I'll read a section from early on in the novel. This character, Sonia, has broken up with her Scottish fiancé. She had a medical residency in London, and she left to come back to Chechnya to search for her missing sister, and this is her making her journey there. Sonia dozed for an hour with her head resting against the window. Every bump in the road was transferred through the glass and recorded by her temple. The sharp pitch of brakes, followed by the bullhorn amplified instructions of a Russian border guard, brought her back to sudden consciousness. The soldiers were all fear and peach fuzz. They ordered the passengers off the bus, and demanded each open his or her luggage in a field 20 meters from the road, while they, the waiting soldiers, crouched with their arms wrapped around their legs and their eyes clamped tight, as if jumping into a lake. The poor bus driver swayed from side to side. Since he was a boy, living on the banks of the Terek, he had dreamed of owning a tour boat. 6 3/4 years earlier, just a week before the Berlin Wall fell, the driver had sunk his life savings into a tour boat, never built, and a contract, never fulfilled, to ferry party members along the river. Now he sat at the ground and rested his back against the tires of the bus, but the land was a swelling and uncertain ocean, and he would feel seasick for many years. The checkpoint left Sonia charged, and as they crossed from Russian-controlled North Ossetia into Chechnya, she stared through the window she had slept on. On the crater-consumed road, the driver made good on his pledge. They passed deserted fields, a toppled farmhouse, a plow resting at the end of a furrow, 4 months past sowing season. At the horizon, the mountains wore skullcaps of snow. It took 10 hours to drive the 200 kilometers to Volchansk. Checkpoints dotted the highway more regularly than the boarded petrol stations, and at each one she carried her suitcase 20 meters from the road and opened it as the soldiers held their ears in anticipation. She spoke to the elderly woman sitting beside her, rolling each word in her mouth like an olive pit before spitting it out. The woman was a wonderful listener, quiet and attentive as Sonia unfastened the latch to what had been her life until 2 days prior. She catalogued Brendan's shortcomings, his unclipped hangnails, his habit of singing Rodgers and Hammerstein while peeing, his reluctance to correct her grammatical errors. But even as she tried to convince the old woman that Brendan would have made a terrible husband, she missed the way he would write his initials in the pad of her thumb with his hardened hangnails, the way the flush of toilet water accompanied "The hills are alive with the sound of music," the intentional grammatical mistakes he would make to see if she would catch them as they took a sledgehammer to the rules of English and reassembled the pieces into a language only they understood. It was wonderful to unburden herself to a sympathetic ear. An hour passed before the old woman pulled a notepad from her purse, scribbled on it, and passed it to Sonia. "I thought you would have realized," the old woman had written. "I'm deaf."
Nice. Very nice. Even in that passage, you can hear the way the story moves forward in the present tense, but constantly refers back to previous events. And in the novel itself, it reaches back hundreds, I think even thousands of years to geological time. You've got a lot of plots going on here. How did you keep track of all that? I mean, you've only got 7 days for it to take place, right?
Yeah. I think, I
Was it J.R. Martin-like with all its Post-it notes and maps?
well, that's what, I feel like so I've been asked before if my room sort of looks like a scene from Homeland or something with the yarn.
Exactly.
And,
Yeah.
And but no, I didn't really keep outlines. I didn't sort of structure the book in any coherent way beforehand. I just rewrote it again and again.
Yeah.
And
learned it.
yeah, I was sort of figuring it out as I went, and each time I rewrote the book, I kind of saw how the pieces fit together a little more. But most of the references to the distant past and the distant future, the novel is told in a sort of hyper-omniscient voice, a narrator who can peer 100 years into the future and sort of give the lives of the grandchildren of children in the novel proper.
And that's odd. I mean, it's very typical for a narrator to look back.
Mhm.
But to these moments, and there are just a few of them, maybe a dozen, where the narrator looks ahead
Mhm.
and tells us what happens in a phrase or something.
Well,
Why did you do that?
It seems like if you're only looking in the past, that's only half of, you're limiting yourself by it seems like if you're writing in the voice of somebody, of an all-knowing narrator,
Right.
Why not look in the future as well? I think that it especially in a story like this where the present tense can be a little grim at times, I felt it was really important to see how the ramifications of these characters' actions, of their betrayals and their sacrifices, of both the cowardice and courage they show, how that sort of ripples out down the line,
Right.
and how a difficult decision that a character feels is futile at the present moment may yield truly magnificent results a few years down the line.
Right. I thought it was essential. I mean, some of it is so grim that I would just cling to those moments where I'd know that so-and-so was going to be okay.
Yeah. I think it's sort of. I sort of looked at those moments where it leaps forward in time as sort of holes in the ceiling where the light was leaking in.
Right.
But it didn't really come together until the very end of the novel, in the final draft. I got so tired of writing the same scenes in the same way that I tried to do it from this much more omniscient and global perspective, and that's what I ended up keeping.
Interesting. Now, there are some scenes of very intense torture in this novel. I read a lot, and I thought it was some of the grimmest, toughest stuff I've read, probably because it was so realistic and I cared so much about the characters. Was it emotionally draining and difficult to create those kind of scenes?
It's there's about 10 pages in a 400-page book, mind
It
you.
seems so much. I would have said 80.
10 pages.
Wow.
but I'm glad it felt much longer than it did.
Your novel was torture.
Ron Charles, Washington Post. But no, I felt that if I was going to write a novel set in Chechnya, it would have been dishonest not to have at least one scene involving the torture of civilians.
And were these things you were hearing about? Were people using bolt cutters and keeping people underground in graves and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, the filtration camp, it's called, in the novel, sort of a prison really, where people suspected of having affiliation with the insurgency would be kept before interrogation. In the novel, it's called the landfill, and it's this sort of unfinished landfill. And it came from a story I read by the Russian journalist Anna Politkovskaya, who was on a Russian army base and noticed that prisoners were being kept in this garbage dump that had been designed to house the army base's refuse, and they were using it to store prisoners. And there was something about it that seemed just to encapsulate the hell of the situation where human beings are kept in a facility for garbage. That just always stayed with me. And so when I was creating my fictitious version of that, I sort of drew from that. But within the novel, the character that does undergo this is sort of the villain up until that point. He's an informer, and we have relatively little sympathy. And torture is designed to take somebody's humanity from them. And it was the very moment in the novel when all of a sudden he became human to the reader. And so I was hoping that the way the book was structured, it makes the novel makes a very clear refutation of the process that he's sustaining.
Have you heard from Chechen or Russian readers?
I have here and there, yeah.
Has it been translated?
It has. Well, it's been translated into a number of languages, but not Russian.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, a couple of weeks ago, I heard from a reader from North Ossetia, which is just next door to Chechnya, and where a lot of the violence had spilled over into. And she was ethnic Russian, and moved to the United States a few years ago.
Oh.
And she said that she had grown up hating Chechens, and that this sort of led her to see them more as human. And it was just sort of one of those small little moments that I think I'll carry with me for a while.
Oh yeah, it does. I mean, even I never hated them. It does so humanize these people that I knew nothing about. Mm-hmm. There are a number of surreal moments in this book, like that field with toilets. And then you told me once that some of the most surreal moments were true.
Yeah, well, I was always trying to find ways of offsetting the grimness,
mm-hmm.
and sort of delving into the surreal, into the absurd, was one way of doing that. And I think that my own sense of humor sort of lines up with sort of the dark Russian sensibility as well. And so there's a scene in the novel in which a village has been attacked, and there are these unexploded mortars lying all over the road, and the characters in this village decide to take toilet bowls from the bombed houses and turn them upside down to cover the unexploded mortars, and nobody can drive down the street for weeks because of all of the upside down toilet bowls. And that was inspired by a story I read in a memoir by a young Chechen man who had used a basin from his kitchen to cover an unexploded shell in his backyard, and there seemed something so surreal and strange about using these everyday implements to sort of save yourself
right.
in that sort of situation that really stuck with me. But throughout Chechnya, you see these sort of surreal acts of remembrance. When I traveled through Chechnya, I visited the Tolstoy Museum. Tolstoy lived in Chechnya for a few years, and in the northern part of the republic. and there's a museum dedicated to him there. And it was the only museum to stay open during both of the wars. The proprietor would sit at the front door with a shotgun every day, and he would scare off any literary
Museum goers.
enthusiasts.
Yeah. Wow.
And so I visited, and I figured, there must be a quill that Tolstoy had written with, or some stack of scandalous love letters or something to justify the enormous risk that this man put his family in by keeping this museum open. And I walked in, and there's nothing inside. There's the walls are barren except for some curtains. And he just takes you around the museum and tells you stories about Tolstoy's life, about his literature, about how his own sense of right and wrong and how you live a good life were inspired by Tolstoy's work. And it becomes clear that this museum is really this castle in which these stories can be safe, and where he feels he can share this part of his life with others. And so this plot of land that Tolstoy never actually stepped on,
wow.
It has nothing Tolstoy ever actually touched.
Oh my gosh.
Has become this sacred place for him, and was able to help get him through these rather difficult times.
That's the work of a novelist.
Yeah.
Just to create that. That is great. One of the reasons we care about this story so much and so emotionally, of course, is this young girl at the center of it that we're so desperate to make sure survives. Do you have any children yourself?
I don't, no.
Little siblings?
I have a younger sister.
How do you keep that character from becoming too precocious, too precious?
It was tough, the endangered child.
Yes, I know.
Sort of been done to death. But I tried to make her sort of stubborn and willful and just kind of a pain in the ass, as I imagine most children are at that age. I certainly was. But yeah, it was. She was a character that I had a tough time, and really had to go back to the well repeatedly to try to make her actually childlike, rather
right.
than sort of this romanticized adult vision of what a childhood would be like. Childhood is terrible. I hated it. I think that there was. Did you ever read Black Swan Green?
Yes, that's a great novel.
It sort of gets at how just the social dynamics between children. It's brutal. But
it's perfectly done in the novel. Tell us about the title, which is odd and long.
It is.
Did people push back on that at your publishing house?
There was. We had some conversations about.
You write it into the novel, I notice.
Yeah, it's a title that I think makes sense when you finish the book, but less so when you're starting out. And I found it in a medical dictionary, of all places. I was going through. On a beautiful Sunday afternoon, through my medical dictionary.
This is why childhood was tough for you.
Yeah. Well, it's weird. My mom wonders why I don't have a girlfriend. But I was looking up various, afoot. And I came across the definition of life, and the second entry down was a constellation of vital phenomena. And there were 6 vital phenomena: organization, irritability, adaptation, growth, movement, and reproduction, that matter has to have in order to be considered organic and living. And there seemed something so oddly poetic about this definition in the middle of this very dense medical dictionary. And at some point I realized that as life is structured as a constellation of these 6 individual phenomena that come together to form life, the novel is structured as a constellation of 6 point of view characters, 6 main characters that together sort of form this interlocking novel.
Interesting.
And so from that point on, it was the title.
It was the title. Yeah. Now this is your first novel.
First published one.
That's what I'm going to ask you about, because we know what the first novel from a young man is supposed to be like. It's supposed to be about a young man in Brooklyn writing a novel. Is there such a novel in your drawer?
Yes. There is, yes, yes. It's not at all biographical. I spent about 5 years working on a book about sort of a young.
Nobody understands.
Nobody understood him.
Yeah,
You know,
kind of wry. Yeah.
It was tragic. But no, I think you need to. I think you need to write your first book and sort of get it out of your system.
Yes.
That in this day and age, it seems like everything we write, we want to publish or put online, and I think that I don't know. I think that there's a risk in, as again, as Alice was saying, that you don't want anything less than your best to go out there, and so this one is staying forever.
Well, as she said, you better burn it, or we will find it and we will publish it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Poor Roberto Bolaño. I mean.
Oh, everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. So, what are you working on now besides getting your driver's license?
Planning my 21st birthday. No, I'm working on a collection of short stories that are set in this region as well, and after that I'm moving to warmer climates, I think. It's interesting, sort of some of the in thinking about research, a lot of the little tidbits that I came up with or found out I wasn't able to really incorporate into the novel. And so some of them have spun out into little short stories.
Oh,
so
nice.
I found,
Very nice.
I read this article about a shortage of body bags in Russia, in the Russian army, because all of the commanders were using them to make field banyas because they're great for insulation. So they would use these body bags to make bathhouses. And there seems something in that that's just so crazy and absurd, and so I wrote a little story about that. And,
Nice. When will we see that collection, do you think?
Probably in a year and a half.
Okay, nice.
And after that, I think coming home.
Nice.
For the third book.
Nice. I forgot to mention you're from D.C.
I am.
Yeah. But now you're living in California, teaching at Stanford.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Would you take some questions?
Love to.
Okay. I think we have a roving mic. Is that true? Yes.
Thank you. It was a great book. Our book club read it, and it was unanimously raved about. Two questions. You mentioned earlier all of the history and research you did, and your bibliography reveals, all the sources. It sort of raised the question of how much of what role did your editor from the publishing house play in helping you as a young first novelist sort of get that all together to take out stuff and put stuff in, and in the same vein, how did you make the decision to go back and forth in time? The book seems to switch in time periods rather than just a straight narrative. How did you make that decision?
Great questions, and thank you for reading it in your book club. In terms of the editorial process, I went through about 4 drafts with my agent before we sent it off. So a lot of the heavy lifting got done there, and the book with my editor was mainly sort of fine tuning the prose. We cut about 50 pages just in sort of single sentence descriptions that were extraneous, but a lot of the sort of the big jigsaw pieces I sort of smoothed out during the drafting process. But in terms of how to or why this sort of strange nonlinear structure, I felt that if I was going to write a novel set in this time period, it couldn't have just a simple beginning, middle, and end. That just the fabric of daily life had been torn and reassembled into all of these strange and bizarre ways that that it seemed like our sense of time and our sense of narrative would be as broken as the cities and the buildings and the families. But all of the characters in the book are actively trying to reassemble their lives and trying to reach into their pasts and find some way of putting what's been lost back together again. And so I wanted to embody that sense on a structural level. And so by moving, sort of toggling back and forth between several different time frames over a 10-year period, I was hoping to create a situation where these individual broken stories were mended into this communal whole, oftentimes in ways that the individual characters didn't quite realize. And I felt that it was really important to see the way that these sort of shards were brought together in ways that none of the characters and hopefully the reader wouldn't have initially expected.
I agree. It's one of the best books I've ever read, and I know a lot of people that feel the same way. Several readers that I know have said the same thing. But I was just wondering, when did you become a writer? Were you writing from childhood?
You're writing in childhood.
I've got more gray hair than you.
You're more honest than I am.
Thank you so much. No, I wasn't one of those writers who, at the age of 2, are composing great epics. I wanted to be a scientist when I was a kid. I always wanted to be an astronomer or an astronaut or something. But you have to pass sophomore year chemistry before they give you the keys to the space shuttle. And I was just really kind of unexceptional at growing up. That I was just sort of okay. I had a lot of participation trophies. Yeah. But never really stood out in any way. And when I was 18 or 19, I started just writing these stories. It was after I graduated high school. I stayed in town for a year, and I took this class at the Bethesda Writer Center. I think they're actually here somewhere. And I was the youngest person there by a couple generations, and we would write these stories and bring them in. And I remember there was this one man. Who when my turn came, he read mine and sort of leaned back and said, I believe that if you don't have anything nice to say, you shouldn't say anything at all. And he proceeded to not say anything. But it was, I just remember just feeling like I'd unlocked this secret world where you could just sit down in front of a piece of paper and make up these things, and it was really just this sense of amazement that such a thing could be done, and it was the first thing that I sort of had much of a knack for, and so I kept doing it.
Also a great admirer of your book and the structure, that sort of digressive, all these wonderful stories that spin out of it. I think that the title is very apt. You mentioned earlier in your talk with Mr. Charles that the seeing into the future was that, I have several questions about this, but one was whether the seeing in the future was part of a late development in the drafting process, and also whether there were other literary models or novels that kind of helped you to come up with this very unusual way of telling the story, and whether you had any rules for helping the reader to be guided into these sort of shifts of point of view and time. And it was like you were shifting from moments of more, sort of realist, limited omniscient writing into like these moments of omniscient sort of free-floating looks into the futures of other characters, which were really interesting. I was wondering if you established for yourself some rules for making those transitions, and at what point in the drafting process did the future come in?
Yeah, It was fairly late in the drafting process. I sort of compulsively rewrite everything, and I never use a red pen or make notes on the manuscript itself. I always just retype everything, and my goal was always to write 1,000 words a day, and I would keep it a record of it on the wall behind my desk, and on the days where I got 1,000 or more, I'd mark it down in black pen. And if it was under 1,000, I'd mark it down in red pen. And I also came from a Catholic family, and so shame was a large part of my childhood. And so I was finally able to put it to productive use. But in the fourth draft, I guess, I had rewritten a couple of these scenes so many times that I felt like I knew them sort of completely, and I got bored with them. And so I wanted to see them from a different character's perspective. And up to that point, the book had been written with a very close third person, where you were only seeing what one character saw. Per chapter, you only knew what that one character saw, knew. And I just jumped into the head of a minor character who only appeared for the space of a paragraph and then was gone from the book. And I just sort of spun out a little backstory for this one character. And it felt like a big bang in the middle of the book, where all of a sudden it could be a much larger, more inclusive, more generous kind of novel. And I quickly realized that I wanted to try to write a book in which there were no minor characters, where every character gets their sentence in the spotlight. And so that's what I tried to do. And it wasn't it wasn't until very late in the process, though, and it was because of this retyping. The British painter David Hockney, he had this exhibit in San Francisco a couple months ago, and he repainted. There was one room that was filled with canvases just of the same landscape from the exact same vantage, and he painted it in different seasons and different mediums, because each time he went back, he said he could see it more clearly because he was seeing it less through his eyes and more through his memory. And I think the same holds true with writing. And in terms of establishing rules, I think that every book, with every book, you're from the first page on, you're teaching your reader how to read it. That you're establishing sort of the rules, you're establishing the expectations and the internal logic of the fictional universe. So I think maybe it's 2 or 3 pages in, we do our first shift into the perspective of a Russian soldier who never appears again. And I knew that I had to plant that early on to create this expectation that, okay, this is the kind of book that can make a shift like this. And in the first 2 sentences, the first one is told from Hava's point of view, and the second one is told from Ahmed's. And so I was trying to sort of lay the ground rules of what could be expected from this narrator early on.
I had a question about how did you preserve the visual details of Chechnya? Did you just take detailed notes every day? And then what was the longest period you were there for, like a year or so? But how do you make, I'm always impressed by writers who can make a remote place visual to the reader. It sounds like you can do that.
Yeah, great question. I was actually only there for 2 weeks, and it was at the final stages of working on the book. I'd wanted to go sooner, but for various reasons it wasn't really possible. And I think even technology gives us this immense amount of research materials. I would go on YouTube, and there would be 1 hour, 2 hour long streams of footage from Chechnya. Just somebody who had put in 2001, who had just put a video camera in the back of a truck and drove around Grozny. And you just see, the city sort of slowly sliding by. But I think you're working partially from sort of research material like that. And then when I went to Chechnya, I ended up changing a lot of the on the ground details. Something like the color of the gas pipes, which were yellow, which I didn't know before. But I think as important as it is to get those details right and to try to make as vivid a setting as you can, what makes a book believable for me at least is if I connect with the characters, if the characters feel real to me, if their psychological and emotional responses to their situation seem realistic and seem honest. And so as much as I tried to get all of the the physical and scene setting details right, it was the details of the characters' inner lives that I spent more time working on.
There's a gentleman in there.
Thanks. Was there a part of the story that didn't make it to the final pages for one reason or another? What was the most painful part for you to edit out that didn't make it in, and why did you feel like you had to leave it out of the end story?
Oh, that's a good question. I ended up at one point the book was 550 pages long, and now it's about 400. And I think there was a long section with the character Natasha that I ended up taking out just because it didn't quite fit in, and sort of it was a bit more of her backstory. But at one point I had these leaps into the future for just about every minor character. So there would be, you'd pass somebody in the street and it would jump into the future and tell them about their the birth of their first child and how they how they fared and all of that. And it got to be too much of a gimmick where it was every time somebody was introduced. Okay, now we're gonna peer into the future, and so I ended up cutting a fair number of those. But I feel like there wasn't anything that got taken out that I wasn't happy ultimately to dispense with. I feel like one of the benefits of working on that first novel that I never published was that now, I threw away, that was 500 pages there, throwing away a few paragraphs here and there, that's no big deal. So I think you want to, it's probably always better to take out than leave in when there's a question of it, because chances are that anything that feels that doesn't quite feel essential to you will feel utterly purposeless to the reader.
One more?
Okay. When I read the book, I thought you had spent a lot more time in Chechnya than 2 weeks, so I'm kind of surprised. So what drove you to that part of the country, that part of the world? It became a lot more real to the rest of us after the Boston Marathon bombings, where all of a sudden Chechnya as a source of troubled people was brought to our shores. So what compelled you to go there years before? Because I know you didn't just write the book last April.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned earlier, I was a college student in Russia, and in Russia, it's Chechnya is very much in the public awareness and front page news all the time, and so in that context, it felt like it was less of a foreign or far flung area, but in terms of getting to Russia, I sort of wanted to see how far around the world I could get, and I'd always loved Russian novels, regardless of what you think of a book like War and Peace. Simply getting to the end of it is a great achievement, and I think that so much of Russian history is so vast, and there are these swings of great event. And you can pin these smaller, intimate stories to these sweeps of history, I think, in ways that can feel quite profound. So that's what I tried to do.
It's such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's a great novel.